不同的动物中发现了在系统发生上与新冠病毒相关的一些冠状病毒，包括菊头蝠和穿山甲。然而，在湖北省采取的蝙蝠样本并未发现新冠病毒相关病毒的一些证据。中国各地的野生动物的采样至今也未发现新冠病毒的存在。
The third part of my introduction will be the research of the animal environment group, the third group of our joint mission. Coronaviruses that phylogenetically relate to SARS-CoV-2 have been identified in different animals, including horseshoe bats and pangolins. Sampling of bats in Hubei province, however, has failed to identify evidence of SARS-CoV-2 related viruses. And sampling of wildlife in different places in China has so far failed to identify the presence of SARS-CoV-2.
在华南市场关闭后的环境取样显示，这个环境中普遍有新冠病毒的污染，是提示符合这个市场可通过感染者被污染的冷链产品、动物和动物制品引入病毒的这些情况的可能存在。
Environmental sampling in Huanan market from right at the point of its closing revealed widespread contamination of surfaces with SARS-CoV-2, compatible with introduction of the virus through infected people or contaminated cold chain products, animals and animal products.
我们在这次研究中，市场上所采集的动物样本均未检出阳性结果，冷链产品我们还未进行相关的检测。
According to this research, all the samples related to the animal products or animals were all negative. For the cold chain products and relevant testing, the research is on the ongoing stage.
新冠病毒可在冷冻食品、包装和冷链产品的条件下存活。中国最近爆发的疫情中的指示病例与冷链有关，那么这就表明病毒不仅在低温下可以长期存活，而且在冰箱温度下这个也可以存活，说明病毒这个传播的能力以及它对传播的作用在低温潮湿的环境下的研究是需要进一步的加强。
SARS-CoV-2 can persist in conditions found in frozen food, packaging and cold chain products. In-depth cases in recent outbreaks in China have been linked to the cold chain. Studies have shown that the virus can survive for a long time, not only at low temperatures, but also at refrigerator temperature, indicating that it can be carried long distance on cold chain products. So further research of the virus in terms of its persistence in the low environment and also in the damp environment where the humidity is relatively high will be the further research.
华南市场有大量的摊位出售冷链产品，但目前我们还不清楚该市场的最初确诊病例跟销售冷链产品的摊位有何对应的关系，这都需要进一步的研究。
In Huanan market, a substantial number of stores sell cold chain products, but it is unclear how well the initial cases in people associated with the market can be mapping or corresponded to the stores that sell these products. We need further research in this area.
我就把这个研究的主要的一些发现给大家简要的介绍，谢谢。
So this is my introduction of our major findings of the three groups of the joint mission.
好，谢谢梁万年先生。下面我们有请皮特先生做介绍。
Thank you, Professor Liang Wannian. Now I would like to invite Dr. Peter to give an introduction.
Thank you, Dr. Mifang and Professor Wanyan for the introduction and for presenting our findings and also how we have conducted our work.
感谢米峰先生以及万年教授给我们进行了简要的介绍，并且介绍了我们在工作当中的初步发现以及我们怎么样开展的工作。
I'm here this afternoon with Marion Koopmans from the Erasmus Center in the Netherlands. She's one of the member of the international team that came here a month ago, together with colleagues from W.H.O and OIE. And she'll represent here the entire team who unfortunately cannot sit with us in the room. And we will share a question later on together.
今天下午呢，跟我一起坐在主席台上的是马瑞尔·库普曼斯教授，他是伊拉斯木大学医学院病毒学系的教授，他是我们国际团队的成员之一。那么我们这个团队呢，也包括来自世卫组织以及世界动物卫生组织等等相关机构的这个专家。我们这个团队1个月之前到达了中国，开展了相关的工作。很遗憾，就是我们的团队呢没有办法今天一起跟我们在这个新闻发布会的房间里，但是我们1个月来一直一起开展合作。
And I would like to start by thanking you, you who are here in the room today, and those joining us remotely. We have followed many of you in the past few weeks, and I would like to salute those who we have seen every day following us on cold days for long hours in the rain and bad weather, and really we thank you for following us. It has provided us with constant reminding of the importance of this work and the focus that the whole world is putting on this work. So thank you for following us.
我也要感谢在现场以及在线参加今天发布会的朋友们，那么也是要向大家表示致敬，因为在过去的一段时间里面，我知道大家都非常的关注我们的工作，包括常常要加班在这里关注我们的一些这个活动，而且呢有的时候天气也不好，比如说下雨啊，你们也都一直在跟随着我们，那么你们跟随在我们身后，时刻提醒着我们开展的工作是多么的重要，是有很多人关注的。
And the international team would like to recognize the impact of the epidemic on Wuhan, on the city of Wuhan, from the individuals affected, the communities affected, both from the governments, the officials, the scientists and the health workers in particular who fought the disease last year. And here in particular, thank and commend the engagement of my colleague, Professor Wanyan, who spent several months here last year on the front line. Thank you for that, Professor Wanyan.
我们这个国际团队呢，是想了解武汉的疫情的所产生的影响，包括从个人、从社区、从政府官员、科学家以及医务工作者的角度去看一看这个疫情所产生的影响。那么还有在这里我要感谢万年教授在过去的几个月里面一直跟我们进行合作，谢谢。
So you have heard the many findings that we have detected out of our studies and work in the past few weeks, and they will be detailed, of course, in the report of this mission that will be released later on. I would like to concentrate on some of our key conclusions from these findings, and we came here with two goals, two objectives. One was to try to get a better understanding of what happened at the beginning of the event in December 2019. This was the starting point for our work, but also the starting point of the initial outbreak. So we focused on trying to understand what happened during that period and try to see if that period had a previous history. Could we move the history of the start of the outbreak further down the line in earlier weeks of 2019. And then, in parallel, we also embarked on trying to understand how it happened. How did the virus emerge and at some point jumped and was introduced in the human population. So these were the two broad, large objectives we had, and all our studies and work and discussion and visits were trying to get better understanding of these two pictures.
通过我们的研究呢，已经有了一些初步的发现，具体的详细的内容会在后面我们的一些报告当中体现。那么这里想给大家介绍一些我们主要的发现。我们此行其实主要有2个目的，第一个呢就是想了解2019年12月份的时候到底武汉发生了什么，因为武汉也是疫情的起点，也是我们此次工作的一个起点。我们是希望了解在那个时间段内武汉到底发生了什么，是不是可以通过找到的相关的线索，能够进一步的去追踪疫情的这个起始的时间，看是不是可以把它追溯到19年疫情爆发之前的几个星期。那么第2个目的呢，就是想了解到疫情是怎么样发生的，病毒是怎么样出现的，怎么样传入人类的，这是我们这是我们要实现的2个目标，所以我们的一些实地考察、一些讨论还有研究，主要是围绕着这2个问题开展的。
So in terms of understanding what happened in the early days in December 2019, did we change dramatically the picture we had beforehand? I don't think so. Did we improve our understanding? Did we add details to that story? Absolutely. And you heard some of the key findings from Professor Wanyan on this picture.
那么我们此行是希望能够了解2019年12月初期的疫情初期的时候一些情况。那么如果你要问我们此行是不是改变了整个的对于疫情的了解，当然不是，但是我们此行确实是加深了对于一些细节、对于一些具体的情况的了解和认识。当然刚才万年教授也给大家介绍了我们研究的一些主要发现。
In trying to understand the picture of December 2019, we embarked on a very detailed and profound search for other cases that may have been missed, cases early on in 2019. And you heard the detail from Professor Wanyan, and the conclusion was that we did not find evidence of large outbreaks that could be related to cases of COVID-19 prior to December 19 in Wuhan or elsewhere.
那么我们对当时2019年12月份的情况呢有了进一步的了解，我们开展了就一些细节呢进行了相关的一些讨论以及深入的分析。那么我们发现在2019年的时候，2019年12月份没有证据表明有跟新冠就是在我们发现新冠病毒疫情之前有大规模的相关的爆发。
We can also agree that we have found evidence of a wider circulation of the virus in December. It was not just only a cluster outbreak in the Wuhan market, but the virus was also circulated outside of the markets.
那我们也发现在2019年的12月份有证据表明2019年的12月份已经有这个病毒的广泛的传播，因为有一些聚集性病例是在华南市场的，有一些不是在华南市场。
And the picture we see is a very classical picture of the start of an emerging outbreak, where we start with few sporadic cases early on in the months of December, and then we start to see small outbreaks where the disease starts to spread in clusters. And we have seen, among others, that happening in the Wuhan market.
那么这样的一个情况呢，是比较典型的疫情爆发的这样的情况。一开始在12月初的时候，可能是有少期的病例，然后呢会出现聚集型的病例，包括在华南市场以及其他的地方。
And these early clusters are usually, and also in this case, the way one detects the first cases, the first sign of this emerging disease, and that's what happened during the months of December 2019.
那么一般呢，是因为有了这样聚集型的病例，才是给我们传递了一个讯号，就是有了这样的一个疫情的爆发。这个时间是2019年的12月份。
And when mapping all the initial cases over time throughout December, combining that with location and mapping of some of them in the markets, in different parts of the market, and combining that with genetic sequences and genetic information from some of these cases, we could see that picture becoming more and more clear of a spread within the market and spread outside the market. Initially very few cases, and then more and more cases as we moved into January 2020.
那么我们也把12月份的病例的相关的发病时间以及地点进行联系起来，绘制了这样的一个地图，然后我们会发现，当然同时还结合它的有一些的基因测序的相关的信息，这个图景呢，就当时的情况呢就越来越清楚了，就是在华南海鲜市场以及其他华南海鲜市场以外的一些地方，首先是发生了少数的这个病例，然后呢才到了2020年的1月份，有了一个大规模的爆发，发现了更多的病例。
And the data and the information we got from the very large amount of looking retrospectively through different studies of mortality data, of surveillance disease data, etc., and also reanalyzing a large number of the initial genetic sequences identified in the early days of the event and early January. All these data fit perfectly and very well in comforting us in the picture I just described.
我们也收集了大量的信息和数据，进行了回顾性的研究，包括死亡率的数据、疾病监测数据，并且对早期1月份的一些基因序列进行了再次的分析。这些证据都表明当时是发生了我刚才描述的那样的一个情况。
Then we embarked on trying to better understand how the virus was introduced in Wuhan and where it came from.
然后我们就开始希望更多的来了解这个病毒是怎么样引入武汉的，是来自哪里的。
All the work that has been done on the virus and trying to identify its origin continue to point towards a natural reservoir of this virus and similar viruses in bat population.
我们也就这个病毒呢，也开展了相关的一些研究工作，希望能够找到它的源头。那么相关的一些证据表明，它是来自自然宿主，在蝙蝠身上呢找到了非常相似的病毒。
But since Wuhan is not a city or an environment close to these bat environments, a direct jump from bats to the city of Wuhan is not very likely, and therefore we have tried to find what other animal species were introduced and moving in and out of the city that could have potentially introduced or contributed to introduce the virus, in particular in the Wuhan market.
但是武汉呢，并不是在蝙蝠的这样的就蝙蝠比较多的这样的一个环境，或者说不是离这个环境比较近，所以不太可能是在武汉直接发生由蝙蝠传人。但是在武汉呢，也有一些其他的动物，也可能是通过其他的动物来 这个病毒呢才引入进人类。那么也许是跟华南市场有关。
The market was dealing primarily with frozen product, in particular frozen animal product, and mainly seafood. But there were also vendors selling products from domesticated wildlife, farmed wild animals and their products.
华南海鲜市场呢，主要是售卖冷冻的动物产品，也有一些海鲜。当然，华南市场海鲜市场里面有一些商贩也售卖养殖的野生动物的产品。
So the joint team in their studies have identified the vendors who were trading these type of products, identified the suppliers of these vendors, identified the farms from where these products were coming from, and they were coming from different parts of the country, and some of the products were also imported products, of course. So there is the potential to continue to follow this lead and further look at the supply chain and the animals that were supplied to the market in frozen and other processed and semi-processed form or raw form.
对，联合团队是售卖这些产品的一些商贩，以及这些商贩的上游的供货商，还有养殖场，并有些产品呢是来自全国各地的，有些呢还有是进口的产品。所以未来呢，我们可能要进一步的去追踪，在供应链上呢开展一些研究。
There was also a large amount of testing for the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19 in many different animal species throughout the country in large number of samples of both domestic animals, farmed animals, wild animals in many different provinces. And through these studies, it has not been possible to pinpoint any animal species as a potential reservoir for this disease, and they indicate that currently and also back in 2019, it doesn't look like there was wide circulation of the virus in any animal species in the country.
也对于具体的一些动物的物种进行了新冠病毒的抽样和检测，包括一些养殖场的动物、一些一些野生动物等等。那么从现在来看呢，现在的证据来看呢，现在以及2019年没有新冠病毒没有在这个中国的动物中有广泛传播。
So the search for the possible route of introduction of the virus through different animal species and the specific reservoir are still work in progress. So what we did after looking at our findings and combining the information that we could extract from this finding, and we then sat down and told ourselves, okay, the next step is let's look at the future. What are these conclusions telling us, and how are we going to move forward in our search for the start of the story? So we look at all the possible pathways for the introduction of the virus into the human population. And you will have the details in the report, but it's basically a very simple illustration of different pathways coming from wild animals into different environments where human and animals and products can interact.
我们也进行了具体的希望呢能够搜寻到从不同的物种通过不同的路径来引入人类的这样的机制，还想希望呢能够了解这个病毒它的一些触主或者宿主是哪些动物。那么基于我们现在的一些主要的发现，我们也列出了下一步的一些计划或者是建议，也就是未来我们要开展怎样的工作，能够帮助我们 回答这些问题。我们在考虑病毒传入人类或者病毒引入人类可能会遵循哪些路径。最终的这个报告当中呢，会对这个问题是有详细的描述。这里呢，我给大家展示了一个图，我们是用图示的方式给大家展示出病毒引入人类的不同的路径，包括野生动物可能通过环境、通过人、通过中间宿主来引入。
Out of that exercise, we then identified 4 main hypotheses or group of hypotheses on how the virus could have been introduced in the human population. And we decided to take that approach to really cover all the possible pathways, initially without any value and without any assessment or judgment, but purely to make sure that we would cover all the possible pathway for the introduction of the virus in the human population.
然后呢，我们就形成了关于病毒引入人类的4个假说。那么我们是希望呢，能把所有可能的可能这个路径列出来，先不设任何的预判或者判断，把可能的路径先都列出来。
Once we identify these 4 key hypotheses, we also did a literature search to make sure that we would not have missed some valuable options that others could have come up with. And then we sat down and went through these different hypotheses one by one and assessed their likelihood by putting forward arguments for and arguments against such hypotheses, and then assessing the likelihood of each of them in a systematic way, in a rational way, using scientific arguments, and combining all the information that we had collectively collected in the past 4 weeks, and also, of course, using an extensive search of the literature for useful scientific arguments.
我们在列出了这4个假说之后呢，又开展了进一步的研究，来确保我们把所有的可能性都穷尽了，而不会落下一些其他的可能性。那么在列出了这个假说之后呢，我们就坐下来一个一个假说的去研究，看看它有多大的发生的可能性。那么在这个过程当中，我们是列出了支持这种假说和反对这种假说的论据，然后进行评估。在这个过程中，我们遵循的是系统性的理性的方式，运用的科学的论据，基于我们现有的已经收集的大量的信息，这些信息包括过去4周里面我们收集的一些信息和数据，也包括我们进行了大量的文献的阅读和这个综述。
So the 4 main hypotheses that we identified and evaluated are first a direct zoonotic spillover, that is a direct transmission from an animal reservoir or an animal species into the human population. So a direct jump from an animal to a human.
我们列出了这4个假说如下：第一呢是直接的宿主的直接的这个自然宿主的溢出，也就是说这个病毒直接从动物传人。
The second hypothesis was through the introduction of the virus through an intermediary host species, meaning another animal species potentially closer to humans, where the virus can potentially adapt or circulate and then again jump to humans.
第2个假说呢是通过中间宿主而将病毒引入了人类，也就是说这个病毒呢是先感染了离人距离比较近的一种动物，在这种动物中呢传播，然后感染了人。
The third one was the food chain, in particular, meaning the potential for food, frozen products in particular, acting as a surface for the transmission of the virus into the human population, and or a food-related route of transmission.
第三种假说呢，是通过食物链，也就是通过食物，特别是冷冻的食物。那么这样的食物呢，作为一个引入或者是人感染病毒的一个界面，或者是造成了跟食物相关的这样的病毒感染。
And the last one was the possibility of a laboratory-related incident.
最后一个假说呢是实验室事故。
As I said, we took a systematic approach to look at all these hypotheses, putting arguments for and against, and assessing the likelihood using a standardized set of parameters. And each of them was then used to help us prioritize future research in a useful direction to help us continue our way forward into better understanding the virus origin.
刚才我也讲到，我们是运用系统性的方式对这4种假说进行了评估，看了它的支持它的一些论据以及反对的论据，然后通过标准化的参数来评估每一种假说它的可能性。那么根据评估的结果呢，可以帮助我们去制定下一步的研究计划，看看在下一步哪些方面的研究是更为重要的。
Our initial findings suggest that the introduction through an intermediary host species is the most likely pathways and one that will require more studies and more specific targeted research.
在我们的发现中，我们觉得通过中间宿主引入病毒通过中间宿主引入人类是最可能的一种路径，因此这就要求我们未来应该在这方面开展更多的研究，更具体的、更有针对性的研究。
Similarly, and connected to this hypothesis is also the one including the possibility of transmission through the trade of frozen cold chain products.
同样，通过冷冻的这个产品感染病毒，或者是病毒引入人类，这也是非常可能的。
And there we are making the difference between the introduction of the virus into the human population and the possibility of the circulation of the virus through long distance and through different settings, or the introduction of the virus into a particular setting, like a market, for example.
然后在这个假说当中，我们还进行了区分，一个是病毒传入人类，或者说病毒引入人类；第二种呢是这个病毒通过长距离的运输在某一种场景下进行传播，比如说在市场。
Then the hypothesis of a direct spillover from an original animal source into the human population is also a possible pathway and is also generating recommendation for future studies.
当然，直接由这个动物传人这种路径呢，也是可能的，也需要我们未来进行进一步的研究。
However, the findings suggest that the laboratory incident hypothesis is extremely unlikely and to explain the introduction of the virus into the human population, and therefore is not a hypothesis that will implies to suggest future studies into our work to support our future work into the understanding of the origin of the virus.
那么，由于实验室的事故引起的这个病毒，这种假说我们觉得是极为不可能的，所以在未来的溯源的相关工作当中，我们不会就这方面开展工作。
So this discussion on the different hypotheses and how they will help us direct our future studies was extremely helpful, and we have been able to then develop a series of recommendations for future studies, future work, in line with the plan we had outlined last July in the terms of reference for how we would go about understanding the origin of the virus and what type of sequence in the studies that would be needed was developed. So the plan we developed in July 2020 is still valid. It has been extremely helpful in guiding our work, and the recommendations we are making at the end of these missions are in line with that approach.
我们关于假说的一些讨论，可以帮助我们对未来的研究提出相关的建议。那么这些研究，关于未来的研究，我们提出这些建议是和7月份我们形成的任务大纲以及相关的计划是一致的，是相符的。在7月份的任务大纲当中，我们也明确了怎么样来开展工作，了解病毒的源头，以及各项工作应该以什么样的顺序来开展。我想我们这一次的工作提出的建议是以2020年7月份我们制定的那份计划为指导的。
So we have identified and will propose in our report a large number of valuable recommendations and ideas for future studies, but here I would just mention some of the key studies and key recommendations we are making.
在我们的报告当中提出了大量的关于未来研究的一些建议，在这里呢，今天我会给大家介绍一下一些关键的未来的研究建议。
One of them is to expand existing integrated databases that connect epidemiological, clinical, and molecular data on cases in particular, and extremely useful as well, genetic sequences. So all that information can be accessible and connected through integrated databases, and that should be done at the global level to facilitate the analysis and connection of data coming from different parts of the world in helping us understanding better and connecting better all the data and information that comes from many of these research projects.
第一个建议呢，就是我们要扩大统一的数据库，包括分子、临床以及流行病学的相关的数据。那么这个数据库应该是全球性的，还要包括相关的基因序列的这个数据。这样的话，使我们能够更好地将全球的数据联系起来。
And that will, of course, also include data from animal surveys, from environmental surveys, and enable us to integrate all this information and make the best use of many of our studies.
当然，这个数据库还应该包括关于动物监测以及环境监测的相关信息，帮助我们未来更好地开展研究工作。
In our search to still try to identify earlier cases because that will help us better understand the start of the event. We would recommend to continue some of the good work that has been initiated in looking for material that can be analyzed that is still available from that time. A lot of this material has been already looked at, and we heard the many studies that have been conducted over the past weeks and months. But we have identified potential new sources of valuable material that could be analyzed and help us perhaps move forward in that direction. One of them, just to give an example, is blood samples from blood banks, and not only here in Wuhan and other cities and provinces of interest, but also use that material elsewhere where there are initial reports and indication that perhaps the virus was also present in individuals in other places and other countries. And that kind of study would help get a better picture of the initial days of the event, potentially if some of them turn back positive. So we have to continue our search for material that can be analyzed and give us clues on what happened in the early days of the event.
第二个建议就是我们要继续的去发现可能的早期的病例。那么我们已经开展了相关的一些工作，找一找当时的一些这个检验的材料。在过去的几周或者是几个月里面，我们已经开展了相关的对于一些材料的这个检测。未来呢，还需要搜寻更多的这样的材料来了解当时的早期的一些情况。可以给大家举一个例子，比如说这个血库的这个血样，我们可以来进行检测，看一看是不是能有一些发现。不光是在武汉，还有在其他省份、其他城市以及早期的其他地方，这个关于早期的这个病例的搜索工作，都可以通过不同的方式来寻找其他的这个材料。
We should also explore new approaches and new ways of exploring and reinforcing the use of serological tests in some of the material that have already been tested. And here we're talking about tests that allow us to look in old sample for traces of the presence of the virus at that time. And there we need new approaches and new ways of doing that.
还有呢，就是我们要采用新的方式来开展血清学的检测。有一些对于已经检测过的材料呢，如果有可能，也在再一次的进行血清学的检测。
And of course, we can continue exploring the potential that the early cases have, even if memory fades, if people are less present and accessible, and if clinical material is also less and less available, there is still value with targeted in-depth studies of some of these cases can potentially yield more useful information. But a lot has already been done in trying to extract all the information that we could extract from these early cases in December 2019.
还有就是对于2019年12月份的早期病例的研究，我们也可以再深入一些。比如说可能有一些困难，比如说可能已经不记得了，或者是有些病例不太好找，或者现有的一些材料比较的少。但是在这方面我们还是应该有更聚焦的关于早期病例方面的研究，以便我们可以获得更多的信息和线索。
And for the studies to better explore the hypothesis that an intermediate animal species or an original animal species was involved in the introduction, here we need to conduct more surveys into certain animal species that could be the reservoir or act as a reservoir, and of course including more sampling and more studies of bat population, not only in China, because already a lot has been tested in terms of bats in China, but we know that some of the similar species found in China are also found in neighboring countries, in the sub-region and in other parts of the world. And there is an under survey because not much has been done in many of these countries in terms of surveying bats, and there we may have some interesting studies as well.
那么关于动物物种的可能的动物物种，我们也要开展相关的我们也要开展相关的研究，比如说在进行更多的调查，看一看有哪些物种可能会成为病毒的宿主。这也举一个例子，比如说我们可以对于蝙蝠进行更多的采样和检测。那么不光是 不光是在中国，因为中国在这方面已经开展了大量的工作，有一些蝙蝠的物种不只是在中国的邻国以及世界上其他的国家也是有的。那么在这些很多地方呢，在这方面的研究和采样是不足的，所以未来我们也可以在这方面开展研究。
We also have to do much more into understanding the possible role of the cold chain, frozen products, in the introduction of the virus and over a distance. We know that the virus can persist and survive in conditions that are found in these cold and frozen environments. But we don't really understand if the virus can then transmit to humans and under which conditions this could happen. It would be interesting to explore if a frozen wild animal that was infected could be a potential vehicle for the introduction of the virus or other viruses into market environments where we know that the temperature, the humidity, the environments could be conducive to a rapid spread of the virus in such environments. So a lot of work needs to be done to better understand these interesting pathways.
还有我们要进一步的了解冷链以及冷冻食品在这个过程当中所发挥的作用。我们都知道，在冷冻的这个条件下，病毒是可以存活一段时间的。但是究竟在什么样的条件下会实现病毒对于人的病毒会感染人？还有就是，比如说感染了病毒的冷冻的食品是通过什么样？通过一定的载体污染了环境，比如说像市场这样的环境，湿度和温度可能都会有助于病毒的传播。在这方面，我们要开展更多的工作，来了解具体的情况。
We should also look further back in tracing the source of the products and the source of the animal products in particular that were in Wuhan market in December 19, and go back and see if we can find products that were produced at that time and that are still available, to also look at the suppliers to these vendors in the market, see if we can go further back in terms of identify interesting clues in the farming environments, in the species being raised in these farms and where they were potentially coming from before that. So that's another areas worth exploring.
还有就是我们要追踪一些动物产品的来源，尤其是这个2019年12月份华南海鲜市场售卖的一些动物产品的来源。那么要调查一下这些动物产品现在还有没有留样，或者有没有样品保存。从以这个为基础呢，再追寻到上游的市场的一些商贩以及上游的一些供应商，看看是不是在这样的调查当中能够发现一些线索，了解在养殖场的相关的环境，以及是不是有病毒，以及这个养殖场附近是不是有可能的病毒的来源。
What was important for us when we developed our hypotheses was to make sure that they were not geographically bound, because since the beginning we have taken an open approach in terms of not limiting ourselves in this manner. One of the clear reasons is that a possible pass from whatever original animal species all the way through the Wuhan market could have taken a very long and convoluted path involving also movements across borders, travels, etc., before arriving in the Wuhan market. And therefore, it's also very interesting to follow up on every one of these clues and preliminary reports and indications that perhaps here and there in other places in the world there were individuals who were infected, and try to follow up on these and connect again the dots, connect the different pieces of information to try to get a better understanding of this whole picture. And again, not limiting ourselves to any preconceived ideas and just following all the leads, following the science, following well-designed and conducted studies.
我想说的是，这些假说呢是没有地理限制的。我们从一开始就是秉承着比较开放的这样的方法，因为病毒的传入，病毒从动物传入到人，一直甚至到华南海鲜市场疫情的爆发，可能经历了很长时间，也可能是有长距离的这样的移动，包括跨境的这样的这个活动。所以说，我们是需要了解各个方面的一些线索，以及我们初步的发现，不局限于某一地，而是要关注世界各地相关的受到影响的人。那么把这些收集到的一些各类的这个信息能够聚集在一块儿，会帮助我们更好的来了解当时的情况。我们是需要以科学的方式来开展这项工作。
Apologize for these two lengthy introductions, but we feel it was necessary to present you with a clear picture of all the work that we have conducted in the past 4 weeks and before, and trying to give you a picture of all our findings and conclusions. And I will now give the floor back to Dr. Mifeng. Thank you.
非常抱歉，可能我的介绍有一点长，但是我是希望通过我的介绍能够清楚地给大家展示我们在过去的4周里面所开展的工作，以及我们通过这4周的工作所得到的一些发现。那么下面我把话筒交回给主持人。
好，谢谢。刚才2位组长介绍了本次联合研究报告的主要内容，下面请各位记者举手提问。提问之前，请先通报所代表的新闻机构。另外，为了给更多的记者朋友提问的机会，希望每位记者提1个问题。好，请举手提问。
Thank you, Dr. Peter. Just now we have listen to the introduction from the team leaders from both sides.
So that was the press briefing by the WHO team that has been probing the COVID origins in China, especially the Wuhan virus. We just heard WHO's program manager Peter Ben Mbarak, who has clearly outlined the 4 hypotheses that the probe was based on. Number 1 being the direct genetic spillover, the direct transfer from animal to human population, that is. Number 2 was through the introduction of the virus that could have jumped on from the animal host potentially closer to humans. Third was the food chain, in particular, the potential food of frozen products as surface of transmission to the human population directly. And last but not least, possibility of laboratory-related incidents. What remains as a conclusion out of this press briefing is that the COVID origins remain inconclusive.
Can be transitioned to human or through some form of frozen food.